So there was a recent New York Times article that at first to me just seemed kind of clickbaity. And then I checked into the study itself, and we'll go over that in a minute here. But the article was something like, scientists agree that there's no benefit to time-restricted feeding. Now, right away, the problem I had with this is scientists agree is a pretty big generalization. I myself have seen several studies that actually show potential benefit with time-restricted feeding. It's a type of intermittent fasting. So yeah, for those of you that don't know time-restricted feeding, it's a type of intermittent fasting where you eat everything within a certain window. So like early time-restricted feeding would mean something like you start eating at 8 and you're done by 4. That, for example, would be an 8-hour eating window. So that would be considered an 8-16 time-restricted feeding, because since there's 24 hours in a day. So 8 hours where you can eat, 16 hours where you fast. So anyway, to say scientists agree, the jury's still out. You know, this one study did come out that showed that there was benefit in time-restricted feeding, but not compared to the control group. We'll go over that in a minute. And there's also several studies that have shown potential benefit to time-restricted feeding. When I say potential, it's because the evidence just isn't that clear yet. But on to the study itself. So this was a year-long study. There were two groups. One group that followed time-restricted feeding for apparently the whole year. Now, I say apparently because these things are sometimes, obviously, they're difficult to track because no study is going to shell out the money to have all these people, especially for a year, in their control and able to see exactly what they eat and feeding them the right kind of meals. So it is self-reported. They tell the people, hey, you need to eat this amount. Make sure you don't go over this many calories. Be done eating by this time. And so they did have to take photos of their food, and they did the best they could in this study. But that's one thing that we have to be a little wary of when it comes to diets or nutrition type studies, is that people are obviously humans, and we get hungry at different times, and maybe we're like, oh, I don't want to admit that I ate this at that time or whatever. So you just have to take part of that into the equation when looking at these studies. But the time-restricted feeding group went a year with only eating in a certain window, and it was an 8-hour window, so it was an 8-16 time-restricted feeding. The control group then had to eat the same amount of calories and was able to eat, I can't remember, but I believe it was whenever they wanted. If it wasn't whenever they wanted, it was a much larger window. It would have been at least 12 hours. And so the results of the study showed no significant difference in weight loss and some other measured parameters between two groups, but both groups did lose a lot of weight. It was like near 20 pounds for the whole year, which is pretty good. But the question then is obviously, can we attribute that to the time-restricted feeding small eating window? So I say small, 8 hours is actually not that small of a time-restricted feeding window. Or do we just attribute it to lessening calories, which time-restricted feeding can obviously be a good measure to do that with, and can be easier for a lot of people than, I've never really believed in counting calories real strictly as far as like a general sustainable way to eat and live. Maybe if you're training for a bodybuilding competition or you're really trying to like tighten things up at a certain point in your life, okay, it may have some merit there. But otherwise, when it just comes to like living, counting calories isn't very practical or sustainable. So in that case, time-restricted feeding could be a great tool for people to, limit their calories because it's easier in today's world to overeat than basically what our bodies are used to. But back to the study, both groups lost a significant amount of weight, which with that comes other benefits that we all know of. And so a little misleading again, I thought in the article, kind of just the headline of scientists agree that there's no benefit to time-restricted feeding. Well, there is benefit. It's just whether that benefit is due to restricting our calories or whether that benefit is from having a smaller feeding window. Now, what I would like to see, and this is neither here nor there, I guess, but I would like to see a study where participants are allowed to overeat within a certain eating window. Now, I guess that might not be a good control group, because it could be considered unethical to have a control group that purposefully overeats, because we know that's not good for people. We know that's not healthy. So to compare them might be kind of tough. But I have seen some interesting time-restricted feeding studies where they allow people to eat ad lib, like eat whatever they want, as much as they want. But in those studies, the window is much smaller than 8 hours. So it might be like I can't remember off the top of my head, but something like there's common time-restricted feeding protocols that are like 4:20. So you only eat like maybe 1 or 2 meals a day. I've seen some that are 2:22. So you have a few hours to, just kind of eat as much as you can. In the past, it would have been called binge eating, but I guess it's okay in these studies, or if you call it time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. But in those cases, it seems like it might not be good, or binge eating or whatever, but it's really difficult to consume enough calories in like 2 hours or in just one meal to be in a caloric surplus for that entire day, especially if you're exercising. And that brings me to the next point of how important it is while doing time-restricted feeding to resistance train, because it is a small fast during that time. And as I've talked about in other videos, just resistance training overall is important, but especially if we're fasting, to tell your body to hang on to muscle. So if we're resistance training regularly and we're time-restricted feeding, I haven't seen a study that combines those things together and has a control group like this study did that the New York Times is quoting. And it's not just the Times. I've seen, I saw it published in some other areas too, but the Times obviously has a lot of exposure. And I didn't like that headline because the jury is still out. And in my opinion, it can't hurt if it fits your lifestyle, because it could be a good way to avoid overeating. And B, some of the evidence does show some benefit to it. Now, we're not 100% certain on that. The studies are not conclusive, and that's why this one recently came out and showed these things. But again, it did show benefit. So it's just, where is that benefit and how much benefit is there? But again, in my opinion, it's wise, if you can do it, to give it a shot. That doesn't mean you need to do it all the time. And a lot of people that I've worked with for coaching and nutrition, and they want to try this, we ease into it unless it fits their lifestyle really well, and they say, oh yeah, I just don't eat at this time, and I'm in that routine, I'm in that habit. But otherwise, you don't necessarily have to do it all the time, because it's over time, how many calories are you consuming versus burning, and that doesn't necessarily have to be every day. I have found that it can get easier. You get into a rhythm and your body starts getting hungry at certain times of the day. So once you do build that momentum, it gets easier to keep it going if you're trying something like time-restricted feeding. But again, the bottom line is that there may be benefit. We're not sure how much yet. Doesn't appear to be any harm unless you're losing lean body mass, which is important to resistance train during any type of fast and just any type of lifestyle anyway. Do what you can as far as hanging on to muscle and making sure you're eating enough protein. So I just did a recent video on that as well, that the RDA for protein is incredibly low. And in these studies, I haven't seen where they're actually calculating how much protein is being consumed. That would be interesting as well, because there's a lot of benefits that come with protein as far as hanging on to lean mass, burning extra calories. I've talked about that in some videos, and that might be a whole video on itself, like the benefits that come along with protein. But I touch on that a bit in my other video of the RDA and protein. I'll go ahead and link that in the description of this one. But thanks for watching. Don't let this article discourage you from trying time-restricted feeding. Again, I thought it was a little misleading. There is benefit to it. It's just whether the benefit is restricting calories or not. But based on my experience and working with people as well, and kind of my intuition, which I know isn't scientific, I do believe, until proven otherwise, that there's benefit in letting our bodies rest and recover from just eating all the time. So, if you were to eat I don't know, wake up and eat, or, eat at midnight all the time, and then also right when you woke up as well, and just have a large feeding window. I don't think that would be good, based on the evidence. That doesn't mean that it's conclusive or proven. And that's why we need more studies to go into time restricted feeding, and I'd love to see them. But that's also why I wanted to do this video, because I thought the New York Times and other online publications that are trying to get clicks didn't shed as much light on the study itself or time restricted feeding in general as maybe a nutrition expert or someone that has dived into the research a little bit more.